Okay, so let's get started coding this controller. Actually, we're not going to get started coding it yet. We need to get some includes. So, also, I'm going to make this video kind of focus more on SerialPort and less on the GUI stuff down here. Just to keep it more concise, and hopefully it helps people looking at SerialPort. So we'll go include QSerialPort, not QTSerialPort, QSerialPort. And you notice it doesn't come up automatically right there. Well, QT doesn't exactly know where to find it yet because we didn't include it in the project file. So we need to go in the project file, and you see this line with Qt plus gets core and GUI. You need to add SerialPort to that line and save the project file, and it's going to update, and now it's got QSerialPort. So let's include a few other things. Let's get QSerialPort info and QSerialPort, or not, I'm sorry, not QSerialPort, QDebug. Okay, so QSerialPort, if you don't already know what it is, it's basically a class that gives you functions and types to work with serial ports. If we go in documentation right here, like you've got functions for setting the port name, getting the port name, setting the parity, the baud rate. You can do read mode, write mode, read write. It's basically everything you need to use the serial port. QSerialPort info, it gives you information about the serial ports. So you can get the vendor ID, the product ID, serial number, whether or not it's busy. If you're going to use QSerialPort at all, then you probably want to use QSerialPort info also, because those two kind of go hand in hand. So it's good to be familiar with it. Now we're going to make a new QSerial. Well, actually, we're not going to do that here. Let's go into the header, and we're going to go QSerialPort Arduino, and actually that's a pointer, and I still have to include it here. So we'll go include QSerialPort and save that. We'll go back here and we'll say Arduino gets new QSerialPort. Okay, so we're good on that part. Now we need to start talking to the Arduino, and that means we need to figure out which port it's connected to. So this is something that I kind of struggled with at first, and I know there's a lot of other people that seem to, is how to find which port it's on. Well, on Windows, I think Windows gives like you can use the system API to find what's connected where. On Linux, I'm sure it does the same thing, but I don't know how to do that yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the vendor and product ID for each of the ports to see what's connected to which port, kind of. But I don't know those values yet, so we have to figure those out. I'm not connected to the internet right now, so we're doing this the fun way. I'm going to go Q debug. Right now I'm just going to look at the number of ports. So number of available ports. And then we're going to look at QSerialPort info available ports. And let's save that and run it. It should tell us the ports. Okay, this is mad at me, something. Oh, I messed up. That's supposed to be length. So let's try that again. It should tell us there's only one port because I've got the Arduino on there. Okay, so we've got our one port, that's the Arduino. We could cheat if we wanted to and kind of just grab just that port, but I'm not going to do that. So I think that this is the better way to do it. We're going to do a for each loop, and we'll go constant QSerialPort info and serial port info, and then we'll do it for each port. So QSerialPort info available ports. So that's going to go through every available port, and then we'll say q debug has vendor ID, not had vendor ID. That's what happens when you don't pay your license fee for that. Has vendor ID. We'll go serial port info dot has vendor ID, and then we'll do an if statement and spit it out. So if serial port info dot has vendor ID, then q debug vendor ID serial port info dot vendor identifier, and then we're going to copy this and do the same thing for product. So I'm going to do a find replace. We'll go I'm looking for vendor, and I'm going to replace it with product. And this one here is actually lowercase. So let's see if that gives us what we're looking for. Should get the product and the vendor ID. Yes, so we've got our vendor ID, it's 9025, and product ID is 67. So you might ask, what's the vendor ID? What's the product ID? Well, vendor ID is something that's issued by, I think they're called USB Implementers Forum. It's USB-IF. I'm not positive about what the acronym stands for, but yeah, a company goes and pays them, and they'll issue them they'll issue the company a vendor ID. USB-IF, they're kind of like the developers of USB standard, like the maintainers, the regulators. So the company goes, registers with them, and they get issued the vendor ID, and then they get the company gets to issue their own product ID for each one of the products. So that vendor ID is going to stay the same for that company, and the product ID is going to stay the same for each one of the products. So say for the Arduino, for example, well, the Arduino Foundation, I guess, who has the vendor ID for Arduino, they'll get their vendor ID, and then they'll also have a product ID that they'll issue for, say, the Uno, and then another product ID for the Mega. So they'll both have the same vendor ID, but different product IDs. And if you can scan across the ports and you see the product ID for the Mega, then, well, you're going to know that that's the Mega there. if it has vendor ID for Arduino. And then if you see the product ID for the Uno, then you know that the Uno is on that port. So that's the goal here. That's what we're doing. So let's get back to the project. We've got the product ID. Product ID is giving us a QUint or a QUint 16, just like vendor ID. So now that we found that, we're going to go save that. We'll make a little variable for that. We'll go static constant QUint 16, and we'll call it Arduino Uno vendor ID, and we'll set it to 9025, just what we found down here. And then we're going to do the same thing for the product ID. So static constant QUint 16, and it's the product ID. $67. Whoops, that's a typo. Okay, so we found that. We don't need that code anymore, but we're going to write code that's almost exactly the same. So for each, again, we can go same thing as before, constant QSerialPort info. Well, I didn't capitalize that. I'm not typing well right now. QSerialPort info, and we'll call it serialport info again. And then this is going to be for all QSerialPort infos, all available ports. And then I'm just going to put 3 if statements nested. And we're going to say, whoops, not has. If serialport info dot has vendor ID and serialport info dot has product ID, then if serialport info dot vendor identifier matches Arduino Uno vendor ID, then if serialport info dot product identifier matches the product identifier we found, then we know the Uno's on this port. So we're just taking the first one. Well, actually I guess it ended up being the last one, but there's only one port. We're going to say serialport info dot port name. We're trying to get the port name here, so I have to save that. That's giving us a Q string. Port name, yeah, that's a Q string, so I'm gonna have to make a variable for that, but we'll call it Arduino port name. Gets that, and I'm gonna make a boolean also, cause, well, not here though. I'm gonna make a boolean just to make it easier to check later. Arduino is available gets true. And we're gonna have to add those to the header. We'll go Arduino port name, and it's a Q string. And we're also going to go make that boolean. So boolean Arduino is available. Okay. So let's see, we set that to true. I'll probably set it to false initially also. Arduino is available, gets false. Arduino port name gets just nothing. So now we've found that. Now we can start setting up the port. So if it's available, then we need to open and configure the port. Otherwise, we're going to give them a message. I'm gonna make it a Q message box. So we'll go Q message box info. Well, I don't want to do information. Let's give them a warning. And actually I need to include some stuff. Let's get number include. It's Qt widgets. It's this, and we'll say port error, and we'll say couldn't find the Arduino. So save that. Okay, get back to opening and configuring. So the first thing we need to do is set the port name. So we already found the port name earlier. We're going to go set it. We'll go Arduino.set port name to the Arduino port name. And now we'll open it. Arduino.open, and we'll open it in QSerialPort write-only mode. So yeah, we're going to open in write-only because we're trying to control this LED. We're just sending a command. We don't need to read anything, so we're doing write-only. Next, we're going to set the baud rate. So Arduino.set baud rate, and we're going QSerialPort baud 9600. Just make sure your baud rate matches what you set on the Arduino sketch. Otherwise, you're going to go crazy trying to figure out where the error is. Well, it's on your baud rate. So make sure they match. Now we've got a couple more things we need to do. We'll go set the data bits, and that's going to be QSerialPort data 8. So you see these different data types: data 5, 6, 7, 8. Just do data 8. If you look in documentation, pretty much everything is data 8 now, because that's the size of a byte. And some of the older ones, it says it's like teleprinters. So I don't think anyone uses those for the most part. We need to set parity. And then we're doing QSerialPort no parity. And now we're going to set the stop bits. Say QSerialPort 1 stop. 1.5 stop is just on Windows, so not doing that. And that's supposed to be set stop bits. not stop bits. So Arduino dot set flow control is going to be no flow control. And that's just whether or not it's hardware or software control. So that looks good. Since we open the port, we should also make sure that we close it. So I'm going to go in the destructor and we'll say if Arduino dot is open, then Arduino dot close. Okay, that looks pretty much good. We're pretty much done at this point setting up the serial port. The only thing left to do is kind of this GUI stuff, and I need to make another function to use it, to use the serial port, I mean. So I guess I can do that. That's the last part of serial port in this project. So we'll get that done. We'll go void dialog. I'm going to call it update RGB, and I'm going to pass it a Q string. It's kind of out of order. Hey, I'm going to have to do a little bit of this later when I do the GUI stuff, but we'll do this right now just so all the serial port is in the same video. And I have to add this to the header. And save that. And then we'll get back to here. Let's make an if statement, and we're going to say if the Arduino is writable. If the Arduino is writable, then Arduino dot write, and we're going to write. You see here we've got the option like constant Q byte array, constant char with a Q int to specify the length. We're going to go with that constant char. So we've got that Q string. We need to convert that to an std string, and then from std string we need to go to C string dot C. Not typing well. String. So at that point we're done. I guess we could print something out to QDebug also if it doesn't open. QDebug couldn't write to serial. Yeah, so at this point we're done with the serial port. All we have to do is UI stuff here that'll call this function to write, but the serial port's set up. I guess I should also mention one last thing. Here, there is a proper sequence to do this in. Well, this is the recommended initialization sequence. You can do this stuff, the set baud rate, set flow control, all this stuff here. You can do that before you open the port, but it doesn't take effect until after you've opened the port. So I don't really see a point in doing it before. And these are also returning a true or false Boolean on whether or not it was successful. So if you do this before you open the port, it's only returning true. Whereas if you do it after the port, you're getting true or false. So you do it before you open, you don't get that feedback on whether or not it was successful, and you've got to do some more error checking down here. Now you're also supposed to be doing some error handling. Also, just opening it like this. I'm not doing that just because I don't want to do it right now because I'm kind of lazy and Don't want to make this video too much longer, but you are supposed to do some error checking when you're configuring the port like that. So just be aware that you should be doing that when you configure it. So next is the GUI. We'll get to that.